welcome. Michael's got a mic for you there. Welcome back to Toronto.
It's always great to be in Toronto. It's good to get the Calgary weather.
Yeah, exactly, right? So you and I sat down on the stage, I think it was 3 years ago, and we had a nice little conversation, but these folks were not here, so I think we'll try and maybe revisit some of that.
Sure.
So, for some of those people in the audience who, it looks like you have a nice little fan group here already, but some of you may not be familiar with Brett, so maybe give us like the 20-second Cole's Notes version of your resume, and I'll sort of start to fill in some of the other stuff, because I know you're pretty modest about your success that you've had.
Well, I was a wrestler, professional wrestler for 23 years, and I never injured one wrestler in my whole career, which I think says a lot about what kind of professional I was. I was always about safety and the guys I worked with. Nobody ever got hurt wrestling me, and I think that led a lot to my moniker of being the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be. Is I was always really the safest, most careful pro wrestler, I think, in the profession.
You're always admired for your technical proficiency as well. It's something that many wrestlers and other athletes have always admired about you.
Well, I mean, if you watch me wrestle, I was a very physical, serious type of wrestler. But there's an art to professional wrestling, and I did that really well. I protected the guys I worked with. The most important thing I did, most important aspect of my job was protecting the guy I worked with. And I wish some of the wrestlers I'd worked with had the same thinking.
And so those skills and the safety that was sort of instilled in you, is that something that you sort of attribute to your father and growing up in Calgary, back with the Dungeon and Stampede Wrestling?
For sure. You know, people always try to put wrestling in a category, but pro wrestling really doesn't have a category. It's really a lot more like figure skating than it is anything else. It's the most critical element was always that, because a lot of the wrestlers were pretty good friends. It's a close-knit little family, despite the storylines in wrestling. And, you meet another wrestler's kids and his wife and stuff like that. And it's important for them to know that you're not going to hurt them.
Right.
So I think, that was always the defining factor of what I was all about. Working for my father, where he was a promoter, it was the same thing. You could never have your top stars get injured or some guy hurt somebody, because there was no pensions and there wasn't much. If you got hurt, you're just out of work, and it's a tough business out there.
So walk us back to, I think it was 1976 when you first started with your dad in Stampede Wrestling, and then 78 was when you actually had your in-ring debut.
It's a mistake. I was not wrestling anyone in 1976. I was still in high school. I think my brothers always tell people I started in 76 so they can make me seem older than them. But that's not true. I started in 78. My first match was in 79. And when I got into wrestling, it wasn't the noble profession that it became. It was kind of like, it was not that glamorous a way to make a living. And I always thought I'd just do it for a couple of years. But then the WWE came along in 1984, and that changed wrestling all completely, put on a whole different level. And it took me a little while to climb up the ladder of WWE and, show them that I could be the wrestler that they wanted me to be. But I had a great life as a wrestler. I had a lot of great memories, traveling the world and wrestling in all the big cities like Toronto and Montreal and New York, and even in England and stuff like that. I have a lot of great memories from being a pro wrestler.
When you retired in 2000 for the first time, it was as a result of a concussion that you'd suffered, right? You sort of walk us through what that decision was like for you. And
well, I only retired one time. I only retired one time for real, and I didn't have any choice in it. I wrestled a guy named Bill Goldberg. He's a professional gorilla, and he didn't know what he was doing. He kicked me really hard in the head in a wrestling match, and my career was over in about 10 seconds with one sort of careless, reckless move.
You know, right then and there, in that moment.
Well, I didn't know for sure, but I know by the time I got to a doctor that assessed me, which was a couple of weeks, I kept wrestling through it, kept saying, like, tell myself that I didn't have a concussion, or maybe a slight concussion. But, you know, when I went and finally saw a doctor, they stopped me and said, you're not wrestling anybody for a while, you're really messed up. And they were right, I just didn't know it. You lose the ability to diagnose yourself when you have a concussion. You're not smart enough, or your brain's not working, so you can't tell yourself, you know, like if your arm's broken, you can look at it and go, okay, my arm's broken. But when you have a concussion, it's like, no, I'm okay. You keep telling yourself and telling everyone you know that you're okay, but you're not. And that's a tough experience.
And then walk us forward to 2 years later, June 24th, 2002.
I had a concussion injury in '99, and pretty much had to retire. I retired a year later in 2000, and I was still getting through the concussion stuff. I had a really bad concussion. It took me about maybe 2 years to at least get sort of back to normal. And I was riding my bicycle in Calgary along the river in downtown area, and I fell off my bicycle and took a sort of innocent-looking little fall on some soft grass. But as soon as I hit the ground, I suffered a complete stroke on my left side. I lost everything on my left side, and that was the toughest thing I ever went through, was my stroke. You know, to have been active the way I was, and you know, I wasn't wrestling anymore, but I was always very active and pretty healthy guy. I was on my way to the gym the day I had my stroke, and it changed my life the second I hit the ground. I can remember the doctors at the emergency hospital in Calgary, at the Foothills Hospital, in the emergency ward there. When they finally told me about 2 or 3 in the morning that I had a stroke, I had a little jelly bean-sized area in my MRI, or the brain scan they did, and you could see it was just that was my stroke, was about the size of a jelly bean. And I remember when they first told me, like, okay, you had a stroke. It's like, okay, so when do I get out of here? Like, you know, when do I walk out of here? You know, they were so vague with their answers that they couldn't tell you when you're going to walk out, because they don't know. But they wanted, you're so frail, and it's hard for you want an answer. You want someone to tell you you're going to be fine. You're going to get up and walk out of here in a couple of weeks. But it doesn't work like that.
The whole left side of your body was paralyzed?
Yeah, I lost everything on my left side. I didn't have a mini stroke or a partial stroke. I had a full-on stroke. I think, you know, what I remember most is the nurses and the hospital staff that worked all the time to keep my spirits up and motivate me, and the physio people that work with you to try to get you to do small little things, like they take your hand, and I remember I'd just drop it on the table, just sit there. They would tell me to try to turn my hand over, just flip it over, like just to the other side. And you couldn't do it. It was like I would have just as much luck trying to turn over a car in the parking lot with one hand. And it was just very, it was a very dark time.
And so going from possibly thinking that you're never going to be able to walk again, be as active as you have been in the past, what was that first moment for you where you had that breakthrough, where you finally could feel the movement or flip it? Or
Well, I think for me the thing that sticks in my mind the most was I remember really wanting to be out of the wheelchair. it was really hard to be in the wheelchair I was in the wheelchair for about 3 months. And when I was sort of good enough to not need the wheelchair, I think that was when it started to turn around for me, where I started to get my confidence back. Slowly but surely started to believe that I would maybe recover, that I could get my life back. And I was lucky. I had a good recovery, and I found that what I did was put a lot of trust and faith in the physio people that worked with me on, sometimes they work on fine motor skills like picking up dice and jacks and toothpicks and things like that. My left hand was so, weak, and it was just never being so discouraged. But it's like a few months later, you're picking them up, and you can actually do stuff with your hand. And through that whole experience, every few weeks I would start to, I remember walking into the stroke ward now. I didn't have the wheelchair anymore. I remember it was an inspiration to the people in the ward. It was like they were so happy that somebody was doing well. And I've always felt that with a stroke, that even now you get little bits of recovery just if you keep pushing yourself all the time. I think I was really lucky that I had a lot of muscle memory. Like a lot of my muscles sort of remembered what they used to do, and they started to respond, and I started to be able to slowly find new pathways with nerves and stuff that would get my arm working again and my feet working. And it was a really challenging time in my life. When I think of all the people that sort of helped put me together again, and there was a whole army of hospital people and people in the stroke ward and different people that supported me. But I felt that as I got stronger, that it was an inspiration to everyone else.
Did you feel the pressure on you, coming from the celebrity that you had and being the best in the world and, multiple championship winner? Was that even more pressure and motivation for you to get better?
In some ways, it was maybe humbling a little bit. I remember, they would want to go like in the wheelchairs. Everybody, like a train, we all go to the shopping mall and go shopping. And I didn't want to do stuff like that. I remember I was like, I don't want to go to the mall with anybody. I was very, I just wanted to recover and get back to my old self. I didn't like being in that state.
Were there any activities that you maybe took for granted before your stroke that now you just relish in, or you enjoy that much more because it tastes that much sweeter or it feels that much better?
Well, it's funny, like I'm back home in Calgary. I got a bunch of my sons and the friends. We have like a little table hockey league, one of those kind of old table hockey games. And I'm still winning. I'm still beating them. I'm the old fox.
The air hockey or the flippers?
No, it's the roll, the slide knobs.
Yeah. Okay.
The real table hockey games. Pretty intense stuff. We were in the playoffs, so I got some big games this week.
So, at what point did March of Dimes come into the equation for you? Were they there sort of right out of the gate to help and assist, or was it afterwards when you made your full recovery?
March of Dimes reached out to me in different ways back then. Same with heart stroke people, they were around. Walter Gretzky was a big inspiration to me. He had a similar experience where he lost a lot of his memory, but he took the time. I would say the even greater one called me up, and he took the time to call me. And Walter Gretzky gave me the best advice. I never forgot it. He told me to don't despair. You never give up.
So you've got a career that has landed you 7 world championships. You're the 5-time WWF championship, 2-time WCW world heavyweight. You have a record-tying 5-time WCW and WWF US championship. You're the 2nd Triple Crown in the WWF and the 5th Triple Crown in the WCW. What's the sweetest of all of those?
Probably the first one. Winning the title the first time in Saskatoon against Ric Flair was probably... Woo! that was a dream come true. So I think it'd be hard to top that one. No, most of the WCW ones don't count for much. They count, I guess, to somebody, but not to me.
Right. So you go from having this stroke in 2002 to rehabilitating yourself to recovering, and that wasn't enough for you. You still wanted to go back to the ring. Is that magnetic pull that you're still...
Well, you know, I think it wasn't, I don't know if it was a magnetic pull, but, you know, when I had my stroke, it was such a hard fall, you know, to go fall so far from where you were. And when I was in my hospital room, I think it was about my third day I was in there, I remember they said, we're going to put a phone in your room today. And it was like, I wasn't very pleasant in those days. But I remember they plugged the phone in, and as soon as they plugged it in, it rang. I mean, it rang right away, like within 5 seconds of being plugged in. I remember thinking, no one's got my number. Like, how did anyone know who? Like, I didn't know who it was, so I answered it. And it was Vince McMahon, of all people. I don't know how he got the number, but he got put right through to me. And if you know my history with Vince McMahon, we didn't have a good history then. But it was a real shock. It kind of stunned me, and I remember I hesitated to hang up or to listen to him. And so I ended up just listening to him on the phone, and he was actually really gracious, and he gave me a nice pep talk and said a lot of nice encouraging words to me. And we had a little talk about my career and different things that he wanted me to do, about being in the Hall of Fame and a few other things. And I think somehow in that whole process that it was a good thing that I answered the phone, and that we kind of smoothed out a lot of our bad feelings that we maybe had. I always thought it was a positive step in the right direction that led to us sort of having a thaw of, you know, bad feelings. Because I've always been grateful for what WWE did do for me, and Vince McMahon, and what he did for me as a champion wrestler, give me that opportunity. And so I think I learned through that whole process of having my stroke that it doesn't do any good to carry around a lot of bad feelings for somebody, or anger, or bitterness. It can only bring you down. And I think I learned that through that whole process.
Were there other people that you called in your life to sort of bury the hatchet, or?
I don't have that many enemies, so at least I hope I hope not. But I think for me, it really made a stroke was one of those eye-opening experiences that made you. That's something to worry about. Like you don't worry about small stuff after that.
So you touched on a little bit on it. You mentioned Ric Flair. You mentioned Vince McMahon. You had some pretty epic rivals back in the day. Steve Austin, another one, Shawn Michaels. Can you maybe talk a little bit about those rivalries? Whether you know the truth behind them, the fiction behind them, or you know, are you still friends with these gentlemen to this day?
I'm friends with most everybody now. Me and Ric Flair are big buddies now. And, you know, I always had a lot of friends. I didn't have a lot of enemies in wrestling. At least I never thought I did. And you know, in the end, I'm glad it's always easier to make peace than war. You know, it doesn't do any good to carry a lot of hard feelings and be angry at people for. Even if you got good reasons, if you could somehow find a way to make peace with it, you're always better off. No sense carrying around a lot of bad feelings.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about the persona of Bret the Hitman Hart, the origins behind that, the name, the Hitman, where did that come from? And we'll talk a little bit more. I got a few more questions on that same line, but I'll start with that.
I was always felt that I had a unique story behind my character and all that. And when I first went to WWF, they didn't have any kind of position for me. I was just lucky I had a job. And I was nobody that they saw any future in. I wasn't like, oh, he's going to be a big star someday. I was like just hanging on to a position. And, they didn't remember when they first tagged me up with Jim the Anvil Neidhart. They just kind of threw us together, and I remember I suggested that they call us the Hart Foundation. But it was like I thought of the name, the Hart Foundation, and they just didn't care. Like, they didn't care what we call ourselves. And so really, nothing I did really mattered. And so I remember when I first had my first interview with WWE, where they let me do a promo talking about some match or something. I remember I started wearing the sunglasses, and it was like a small little thing.
Where'd you get the sunglasses from?
I bought them from a guy at a gas station for $10. He needed gas money, and I said, "What kind of glasses are there?" I think he just stole them from the gas station, but they were mirrored Ray-Bans, and I went, "Hey, they're pretty cool." So I took them. I had them in my bag all the time, and then they told me I had an interview, and I was such a nervous wreck in those days for doing those